Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the amendment that I am offering this afternoon is pretty straightforward. It would effectively release wilderness study areas if within 1 year of receiving the recommendation, Congress has not designated this study area as wilderness. A lot of discussion in the news of late with the President's announcement on Sunday that he is seeking to put an additional 12 million acres in the Anwar area in Alaska's North Slope into wilderness status, including the 1002 area, the area that has been specifically designated for oil and gas exploration. But I want to make sure people understand that this is not just an Anwar amendment. This is about the wilderness study areas that we see that are currently on the books. According to the Congressional Research Service, as of the beginning of this year, Congress has designated 109.8 million acres of federal land as wilderness. Just over half of this wilderness is in my state of Alaska. We've got over 57 million acres of land, of wilderness in Alaska. 90% of the wilderness under the management of Fish and Wildlife Service is in Alaska. But as a practical matter, there's more out there. There are more acres that are proposed for wilderness designation. For example, the Bureau of Land Management manages 528 wilderness study areas containing almost 12.8 million acres located in primarily the 12 states in the West as well as Alaska. But you also have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who has a wilderness study process through its land use planning to identify areas to be proposed as wilderness. So there's some history as to how we got to dealing with these wilderness study areas. Areas that are identified by agency officials as having certain wilderness characteristics, as identified under the 1964 Wilderness Act, were classified as wilderness study areas. BLM received specific direction in the Federal Land Policy Management Act of 1976 to go ahead and inventory and to study its roadless areas for wilderness characteristics. Then by 1980, the BLM had completed field inventories, designated about 25 million acres of wilderness study areas. So then, since 1980, Congress has taken a look at some of these. Some have been designated as wilderness, and others have been released for non-wilderness uses. The BLM has also taken it upon itself to designate wilderness study areas through its land use planning process. The point here, Mr. President, is that once an area has been designated under the BLM or Fish and Wildlife Service study regime, it effectively becomes de facto wilderness. The designation then limits and restricts the ability to do just about anything for fear that it might impair the suitability of the area for preservation as wilderness. So until Congress makes a final determination on a wilderness study area, the BLM or the Fish and Wildlife manages these areas to preserve their suitability for designation as wilderness. So even though Congress hasn't acted, because it is Congress's purview to do so, even if they haven't acted, the agencies manage as de facto wilderness. So my amendment says we're going to change this. We have to change this. Congress needs to reassert itself into this equation. And as the final arbiter of what is or is not designated as wilderness, Congress can and should make the decisions in a timely manner about the wilderness status. So what my amendment does is pretty simple. If Congress doesn't act within 1 year to designate as wilderness, an area recommended for wilderness designation is released. Just goes back to the multiple use. That way the agencies are not managing areas to preserve a possible wilderness designation as an option for Congress. Instead, it can get on with looking at a broader range of options for how to manage that land with the local people, other interested stakeholders, through the land use planning process that apply to each of the agencies. So some may argue, look, Congress needs more time on this. I would say we've had plenty of time to review these areas. Some of these wilderness study areas have been pending since the 1980s. That's plenty of time to figure out whether or not it should be put in wilderness status. Congress needs to make a decision already. So I would ask my colleagues to support my amendment, to take a look at what is contained, and not just think about the ANWR situation, but think about the applicability within your respective states.